But the major topic today is not just selecting for grit, but also building grit in your company. So I have three major points. The first point is going to be glossed over very quickly, which is, what it is and what it predicts. The short story there is it predicts a lot of good things, like succeeding in West Point, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to put a play in here for talent. I'm speaking a lot these days to journalists, and they love to write the story that it's all effort and talent doesn't matter at all. But I do not want you to go out and take that as the take home, because that's ridiculous. I mean, you obviously want the most talented people in whatever domain it is that you're recruiting, but you also want the grittiest. And the take home really is not that one is more important than the other, but actually that they're often inversely correlated. So we find that the people who are really talented are often a little less gritty than the people who are just a notch below in talent. So the take home might be that if you only look at GRE scores and did you go to Stanford and how smart are you, and you don't care at all about persistence, effort, taking good feedback, learning, getting in there with the same exact energy day after day, year after year, then you might be going awry. But I don't want to say that talent doesn't matter at all. We're going to talk about selecting for grit, not only using the kind of questionnaire I just showed you, but also how to read a resume for grit, which is something we've been doing for Wharton and also for organizations like Teach for America. And then finally, probably the most important part of the talk would just be, from our perspective, from where our lab sits, what can you do to instill grit in your employees individually and also create a culture of grit for the entire organization. So I'm going to start off with a quote from Francis Galton, who has one of the highest recorded IQs in history, about 200. He taught himself reasonably sophisticated mathematics when he was 8. And he's the half-cousin of Charles Darwin. He was personally obsessed with achievement, and he wrote a whole book about it, What Makes for Truly High Achievement in Life. And it boils down to three ingredients from his point of view. The first one is talent, right, or ability. But the second two really are grit, right? It's passion or zeal, and it's the capacity for incredible hard work. And the only modifier I would add here is that it's not just passion and hard work for a day or for a week, it's passion and hard work for years and decades. So I've often had undergraduates, say Wharton undergraduates, come up to me after a talk and say, I'm going to tell you why I'm so gritty. I had to raise $20,000 in 1 week, and I didn't sleep. I did it, and then he has all these colorful anecdotes. And I said, that's terrific, but that's not grit. Like, come back next year and tell me what you did, right? I mean, it's not this kind of sprint. It's more of a marathon kind of quality. So the formula that sort of drives our lab is this. It's like distance equals rate times time. So achievement is really going the distance. It's actually getting somewhere. Rate is like talent. And I think this is what we mean. When you see a little kid on the soccer field and they're awesome, I think what we mean by saying that kid's gifted or they're talented is the rate at which this kid progresses is phenomenal. He puts in 4 days of practice, and he gets more out of it than this other kid who puts in 4 days of practice and is only a little bit better. Right? So I want you to go out and find talented people in whatever domains you are working in, because you want the kids who learn fast. You want the employees who are quick at picking things up, but you also need effort. So this is what Anders has found by studying Olympic swimmers, World Cup soccer players, champion Sudoku players, the top radiologists in the world, mathematicians, violinists, cellists, et cetera. Across all the domains that Anders studies, and he is the world expert in experts, there's a skill curve that looks like this. So when you're starting out in a field, you often are making reasonably halting progress because you don't know anything. So those of you who have recollections of your children playing piano, it's kind of tortuous for the first few years. It's that they don't know anything, right? So they're just really getting the mechanics down. But then you get this fun part, which is where your skills are actually improving reasonably quickly. You have the fundamentals, and you're getting better and better. But then what happens to people really in any domain is that there is some limit, right? You can't get faster and faster at running and then run a 1-minute mile. So there is some limit, but the key take home from this graph is that in all of the domains that Anders has studied, there's about a 10-year period during which skill is acquired, and you cannot shortcut it in terms of getting to world-class performance. So he does not find that people become world-class anything in 3 years, in 4 years, et cetera. And what 10 years boils down to, if you do what he's found, which is 4 hours of deliberate practice a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, is 10,000 hours, which is why it's called the 10,000-hour rule. Now, I think there are a couple things to note. One is, by practice, he does not mean going out and doing something over and over again. He means a very specific kind of practice. And in some conversations that I had over breakfast, I think this is going to resonate with you. It's practice where you have and those of you who actually did sports, I think it'll really resonate with you, right? So as opposed to just like going out and trying to play soccer better, the coach usually gives you a really specific training goal for the next day. You know, today I want you to work on your left foot and how it's turned out, you know, and I want you to work on this one particular kind of shot. That's typical of deliberate practice. It's very specific. As a manager, therefore, giving feedback to employees, say progress review time, it can't be like, hey, I really want you to get better. It can't even be like, well, I really want you to get better with your sales. It has to be extremely specific. Oh, the memos that you're sending out, they are, you know, 20% too long. I think you can cut the length. I mean, really, really specific. Deliberate practice is always specific and targeted. And the other key feature is that there has to be this repetitive feedback. You have to get feedback almost immediately after you perform something, and then you have to have immediately the opportunity to try it again. There was a study where they read 300 biographies of geniuses who had made marks on humanity. And the characteristics that really stood out for those people who are both talented and had impact on the world were these two traits. And again, they are the sort of two parts of grit. You know, not seeking something fresh because of novelty, not always looking for a change. Probably the Achilles heel of smart kids that I teach at Penn is that they're always looking for something new. And then the second one is more obvious. It's perseverance, tenacity, doggedness in the face of adversity. So I'll just quickly breeze through these. Grit predicts things like graduating from West Point. It predicts keeping your job in sales, which, as you probably know, has a 50% turnover in the first 3 to 6 months in most industries. It predicts actually earning more money when you are there on the job. It predicts who's going to win the National Spelling Bee. And in most of the studies that we've done, what I'm finding, this is maybe one of the most important findings, is that the really talented people on average are just a little less gritty, right? So, you know, you do have this trade-off. And we can talk about why that would be. I think one possibility is when everything is easy for you, you don't learn to get up, right? You know, if you never fall down, you don't learn what that means to actually get up, dust yourself off. And I think the self-concept that a lot of really talented people have is that, you know, things are easy for me and that's how I get by in the world. If you take a really gritty individual, often the self-concept they have is, I'm here because I work harder than any other person in the room. Like, give it to me. Like, give me the feedback, make it specific, make it hard, watch it. Like, I will come back tomorrow and learn from it. And I think that ability, that self-concept actually drives a lot of their performance. In a study that I did with Anders, the 10-year rule guy, we looked at spellers, and we not only wanted to predict who was going to win the National Spelling Bee, we also wanted to ask them, you know, what was it like for them to do practice for the spelling bee? For those of you with school-age children, I'm going to tell you how to win the spelling bee right now. There's 3 things that kids do to train for the National Spelling Bee. They can read. You know, they actually all love words, so they love reading, playing Scrabble, word games, etc. So we classified that as leisure activities that were verbal. The other thing kids are recommended to do is get tested by mom or dad over the breakfast table. How do you spell Uspracht, which, by the way, was the winning word when we did this. And I'll spell it for you later. You know, you can do that. And the last thing is what we would classify all the activities from their journals that were deliberate practice. Things that the kids couldn't yet do, highly focused and specific practice activities that, by the way, in our research, were not fun. So these are things like, you know, researching obscure word roots that rarely appear in English language words. Writing a word that you can't spell over and over again vertically on a piece of paper. They don't like doing that compared to testing or being quizzed and verbal activities. So that's why it's the least enjoyable. That's the black bars here. And actually takes the most effort. But it's what predicts who wins. So if you look at these three activities and you say, how do we know which of these predict winning the spelling bee a month later, what we find is that the grittier kids, they really do more deliberate practice than anybody else, and it's only deliberate practice that predicts who wins the spelling bee. I put in here openness to experience because that's just being intellectual and liking to learn. That, if anything, inversely predicts winning the spelling bee. Loving to learn and being curious actually is an impediment, not a help in winning a national competition like this. We did another study for Wharton, and we're finishing it up right now, but essentially what we're finding is that the grittier applicants, based primarily for Wharton, not on their college extracurricular activities, but really about industry changes, right? Somebody who leaves investment banking to become a curator at a museum and then does something else, you know, those people actually do the worst in Wharton's MBA program. We're not following up to see whether they make less money. Occasionally you will find somebody who flip-flops, has an epiphany, and they're dead on. But you have to take that risk as an employer, if whether, you know, are they going to be the exception to the rule, or are they going to be the rule, which is that, you know, that person's going to continue to flip-flop going forward. I want to end on this topic of, you know, how you might build grit in your employees and how to build a culture of grit, and hopefully end early enough that we can have a little Q&A. The first thing I want to say is that personality traits actually are reasonably hard to change. So I like to say that they are pretty stable. However, they're not completely static. So people do change. It's just that, you know, it's like marrying someone. You know, they could change, but they really might not. So marry carefully, right? You know, I actually think that there's more emphasis to be put on selecting gritty employees than taking ungritty employees and miraculously making them gritty, right? It's pretty hard to change the way people are, not impossible. There's a lot of genetic stuff going on with all personality traits. It turns out that every trait that's been studied, from IQ to being a Republican, is genetic, right? So there's about the same amount of genetic, right? So even liking broccoli is genetic, or chicken. That was a recent study. And so you kind of can't change somebody's DNA when they come through the doors of your company. You can change their experience, and that's where most personality change comes from. The older you get, the less change there is. So if you've got a 22-year-old that you're trying to set straight, you have a much better chance than setting straight a 52-year-old. So that's the other thing. I don't know what ages you are recruiting, but you might want to take that into consideration. If you're really sort of recruiting people who tend to be, you know, 45 to 65, select for grit. Don't try to build it so much. And then here, you know, I want to emphasize culture, because human beings are exquisitely social animals. We respond to culture. So when you, you know, hear things that are kind of miraculous, either in a good way or sort of awful, like Abu Ghraib, or like, we're really social creatures. When everybody is doing something, it makes us do that, right? So it's possible to kind of create a culture where most of the people are gritty, and that should bring up the less gritty individuals. I think that from your perspective, you know, in terms of a manager or a leader, the mantra that if I were to write a book, which I will never write because I don't write books, but I would have a chapter called Choose Easy, Work Hard. This actually comes from a conversation. I had this McKinsey consultant from San Francisco randomly call me. And he said, you know, I watched your TED video, and I'm a McKinsey consultant in San Francisco. I have the impeccable resume. And I said, you needn't say more. I know it's probably Stanford 4.1. You've got, you know, GRE scores that are like through the roof. Let me guess, you're unhappy. And he's like, yeah, exactly. And I was like, you know, I don't usually take calls like this, but having been a McKinsey consultant myself, like, let me have therapy with you, so go for it. So he tells me that, you know, he doesn't know what he wants to do. He knows he doesn't want to be at McKinsey, but he doesn't quite know what to do. So I start probing him on what he likes and what he's good at. And it was really a fascinating conversation, because the more we got into things that were easy for him, the more he sort of shied away from that as what he should do next. And I said, no, you're getting it confused. When I say that my research program shows that effort and hard work and perseverance are important, that's when you have already chosen the path that is, in a way, you know, your best fit. Choose easy, choose what is great for you, then work your ass off, right? So I think what he was getting confused with is, like, he knew effort was good, but he was kind of making his choices based on effort, not once you're in the game, you know, and in sports it's often called, you know, race your strengths. Then train your weaknesses. Choose the sport based on what you're good at, but then work on what you can't do.